So welcome everybody. Sorry for that little delay. We are really delighted to be with Naomi Fisher. I've been really looking forward to this chat today. My name is Juliet English. I am from Streams, which is a website, streams.education, that has been set up by 4 home educating parents to offer support to other home educators through the sharing of stories, the sharing of reviews about resources to try and remove some of the confusion and the fear and the anxiety that people feel when they start that home educating journey. And we set up the website. We launched in October last year, and we're just gradually building up. It is a membership website, although at the moment most features are free to anyone. But we want to build up the membership, and then in time these webinars will be offered to members. And there's things that we're planning on building up. And in future, we want to add more features, such as the ability to connect with each other and give more direct support. We'll also offer mentoring and coaching for people who need that. Before we go on, I'm going to say right now that we have a very special giveaway today that will be available to, number 1, people who are actually in the session today, and number 2, people who are signed up members of Streams. So you need to go along to the website, which is streams.education, and sign up as a member. And if you're signed up as a member and you are in the session today, you will be eligible for this giveaway, which is Naomi's book, which is called Changing Our Minds. And she's going to talk a little bit more about that, but it's a great offer, and we're very grateful to Naomi for offering that to those who are with us today. Very special. So Naomi is a clinical psychologist, and she's mum to 2 children who she has home educated. And the book Changing Our Minds that she's written is Changing Our Minds, How Children Can Take Control of Their Own Learning. And I want Naomi to tell us a little bit about herself, about her background, and how she arrived to where she is now in her thinking around education.
Hi, Juliet. It's so nice to be here. So I tell lots of different stories about how I ended up where I am today, because I think there are lots of different narratives, all of which are true in different ways. But one of the things that I think has really came together for me was my own experience at school, which was that I actually went to 11 different schools whilst growing up, because my parents moved around a lot. And in some of those schools, I was very happy. And in some of those schools, I was so unhappy that I refused to go. So I was actually a school refuser at age 5 and at age 14. And one of the things I learned from my experience of school and moving through the school systems, and I went to Steiner School, I went to a comprehensive school, I went to international American schools, I went to a boarding school at one point, I went to so many different kinds of schools. And all of them seemed to believe that how they did things was the best way to do things. In fact, perhaps the only way to do things. And yet, as someone who was coming through different systems, I could see that the way they did it wasn't the only way to do it. So, for example, schools in the UK thought that uniform was really important and that we had to dress in a very particular way, obviously. And that if we didn't, didn't show respect, and that was a very important part. Like my school in Birmingham put a lot of effort into making sure that we kept our uniform smart and looked right. But I'd just come from a school where we had no uniform and where clothing just wasn't an issue, really wasn't. People wore jeans and T-shirts and we just kind of got on with it. And no one spent any time in enforcing uniforms. So I started to think about, what are schools doing what do schools do that everyone assumes is really important, but actually maybe it's not as important? And that kind of extended to not just uniforms, but also to education, because people would often say, well, the curriculum's linear. You have to do this when you're 4 so that you'll be able to do this when you're 5. And then you have to do this when you're 5 so you can do this when you're 6. But I was moving between these very different systems where I hadn't done all the stuff that they thought was essential beforehand. And it didn't seem to matter that much. And, it wasn't actually that difficult to catch up. And I certainly wasn't years and years behind with something just because I hadn't studied it before. And that made me start to think, hang on, is this, what is going on in this system? Is a lot of what we're being taught is education at school actually simply growing up? You know, am I better at doing things now because I'm 15 rather than when I was 6? And actually, although people think that that's because they've been taught certain stuff, it isn't necessarily. So I started to challenge lots of stuff as a teenager. And then I became a clinical psychologist, and I learned a lot about child development and how children learn. And it was all about how children learn best in context of relationships, how they learn best through play, and how a sort of enriched learning environment is one where children can make choices for themselves, they can explore things, they can test hypotheses, and how children are really natural born learners. Then I had my own children, and when we were all set to send my oldest child to school, we had a place at the school down the road, which was had an excellent Ofsted report. He was very young for his year. He's a July birthday, so he would have been going into reception aged 4 and 6 weeks, something like that. We went along to the day, you know, the kind of induction day that you have. And I felt a bit uneasy about it. And they gave us a list of words. And it was a list of words called keywords. And they were things like the, but, if. And they said, we'd like you to teach your children these words over the summer so that they can come in September ready to go. And I looked at my son, who was then 3, and who was really most interested in mud and splashing around and climbing things and making messes. And I looked at this list of words and I thought, wow, I'm about to teach him that learning comes out of context. Because not only are these words something he has no interest in, they actually on their own have no use at all. You know, they were words like the and but. And they're these keywords, and I can see why they're important for children to learn to read. But they really, it just was a moment for me of thinking, gosh, I'm going to put him in this environment where learning is devoid of context, where he's going to be made to learn things regardless of whether he feels they're important or not. And I just don't think this is going to go well. I can't see it going well. So because I was a clinical psychologist, I have worked with children who are really unhappy at school. I'd already worked with children who refused to go to school. And I could just see us going down that route. And I thought, let's just not go down that route. Let's just do something different instead. And probably like many people here, I thought at the time, well, we'll wait until he's about 7. Maybe things by then he'll be more ready for school. You know, you hear about other countries in Europe where children don't start school till they're 7 or 8. And you think by then maybe he'll be ready. And of course, what happened is that the school system moved on. And he also moved on, and he moved on in very different directions to how he would have moved on if he'd been to school. So by the time he got to 7, the gap between him and school seemed even wider than it did when he was 4. I mean, the gap was pretty wide of what was going to be expected of him at 4 and what was going to happen. But by 7, you know, his peers were used to having to sit in a chair for most of their day and follow a curriculum and do what the teacher said. He was used to being able to do what he wanted, play when he wanted, not get dressed if he didn't want to, and to spend his days doing the things that he really enjoyed. So I thought, okay, this isn't going to work. This is going to be a long-term thing, doing something different. But the more that I thought about it, the more I thought all those things I learned about in psychology when I was training, all the things I know about how humans thrive and how humans feel good about themselves, all of these things are really important in education, and yet school doesn't really acknowledge them. And I just felt, I remember my children used to go to a swimming group, not to a swimming group, they used to go to a sports group in a leisure centre. And I used to swim whilst they were in this sports group. And it was pretty well the only time in the week when I had kind of space away from everything. So I'd be swimming up and down, doing these lengths, and I'd be just mulling over, there's something here about education and psychology, which people aren't necessarily saying, and that maybe it would help people to know that I think there's a whole set of psychological theory which really backs up what we're doing as home educators, and that people aren't talking about. So that's where my book came from. And I thought, I want to talk about this. I want to bring these ideas together. So bringing together psychological theory and self-directed education. And that's really where I got where I am today.
Oh, that's amazing, Naomi. Just the fact that you were even thinking about that as a young person shows like an incredible sort of awareness. I think for me, it's understanding how learning happens.
Mm-hmm.
And learning doesn't happen when according to this person says, you know, somebody says, oh, it has to be within 4 walls, sitting at a desk with a blackboard in front of you and a person talking at you. Just, it might look like learning to you, but it actually could mean that nothing is going on at all in the child's brain.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we wanting to challenge how
Absolutely.
people think about learning, right?
And in fact, to me, that feels like quite an impoverished learning environment, because there's only one way to learn. There's only one set of stuff to learn. Basically, the way learning is defined in that environment is, have you managed to absorb what the teacher is trying to teach to you? Whereas when I see the way my children learn now, they pull in information from all sorts of different areas and they learn all kinds of stuff, which just surprises me on a daily basis. And their learning is so rich because they can bring in conversations with adults, they can access direct instruction if they want to, but they're always pulling in stuff and bringing it together. And that's how I learn now as well as an adult.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the thing is that we often learn to learn as adults. We have to almost relearn how to learn.
Yeah.
But actually, if you can start out from the beginning, learning the way you actually were designed.
Yeah, because young children do this. All young children do it. And we know that that's the odd thing. I think the strange thing about our education system is that we recognize that very young children can direct their own learning. We provide nice environments for them to, if we're lucky, if they're lucky, and if we have good, best practice nurseries, children get a lot of choice about what they do. There are great and exciting things to do, and they can choose. Then as they get older, it's almost like the moment that we might be able to persuade them to do something different, we do persuade them and we control them and we take away that autonomy. So we have this bizarre situation where 14-year-olds have less autonomy than 4-year-olds in the education system.
And even play, if adults are too involved with play and interfere too much with play and try and control play, it actually loses.
Stops being play.
Yeah, it
absolutely.
loses. It's like a parent trying to teach a child how to draw a person. And saying, this is how you draw a person, they draw a stick man.
Yeah.
Instead of allowing the child to sort of figure out for themselves, how are they going to show what they can see.
Yes.
I think it's helpful to sort of understand, to have some sort of definition of what self-directed education is. Do you want to?
Yeah. So, I mean, what I mean by it, and that's not necessarily what everybody else means by it, but what I mean by self-directed education is an entire education where the learner is able to choose what they learn, choose how they learn it, and they're allowed to choose to stop. So it isn't really about pedagogy. It's not about, people often confuse self-directed education with, well, we just let them do what they want, or even just leave them to get on with it. And that's absolutely not how I understand self-directed education. What I understand it as is it can be adults are very involved with self-directed education often, but what they're not involved with is telling the child, this is what you're going to learn, this is when you're going to learn it, and this is how you're going to learn it, and you can't stop because, like school, you can't stop, you're here, that's what you're doing now. So for example, the way I define self-directed education means that you could have a group of children and half of them in that group could be self-directed and the other half could not, despite the fact they're all doing the same thing. So for example, if you're attending a maths class and half of those kids are there because they really like to learn about maths, they're really interested, and they know that if they're not interested anymore, they can stop. And the other half are there because they've been told, you've got to learn about maths, you've got to attend this class, and you're going to keep attending it. You've got everyone appearing the same, but the quality of the learning is going to be different. And to me, it's that quality that's so important, that quality of choice and autonomy, which I think there's a lot of evidence really transforms the quality of your learning. So, and I know that as myself, and I'm sure if everybody here reflects on their own learning, I know that when I'm made to learn something, I immediately lose interest. And I remember reflecting on this as a young person as well, because I loved to read when I was young. I mean, I was just your archetypal bookworm. I read all the way through my 6th birthday party. My parents always say I would prefer to read than to do anything else. Except when I was told I have to read this book. And when at school would say, you need to read this book, immediately I would struggle. I would be counting the pages. I just couldn't do it. And of course, the way that school works is that they looked at me as this really avid reader, And they always said, oh, she should be reading other things. I loved fiction. I was a fiction reader. I just charged my way through fiction books, sometimes 2 a day. And by the time I was 8 or 9, my teachers were saying she should be encouraged to read nonfiction. She should be stretching herself. She should be reading more complicated books. And I remember the nonfiction books seeming very boring at that stage. I think now there are many more interesting nonfiction books for children, but there really weren't things that struck me as interesting. But I remember being encouraged to read things like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne, or Charles Dickens at age about 10, because I was this avid reader, and I found them so boring. And I feel really sad about it now, because I've never gone back to these authors. It's almost like and I feel like, why couldn't they just do what I would do as a self-directed educator, which is great, you love reading, let's find you more of the things you love to read. And let's trust that as you develop, you will want to seek out more difficult things. You will want to challenge yourself, because why wouldn't you? Because you're a person, in the same way as I challenge myself all the time. I look out challenging things to read now, but I can't bring myself to go back to Jules Verne, I have to say.
Yeah, I think the thing is, I think what you can, as for some children, school provides their self-directed education in a way, because if a child is very happy there and thriving and likes the way things are structured, they can still be self-directed, because they don't need a lot of prompting from a teacher and so on, and off they go. So I think it doesn't rule it out, but it doesn't work for everybody. I think that's we're all individuals. So what would you say, like having done this, having looked into it, what are the advantages of self-directed education?
So I think the advantages of, one, that we never take away the responsibility from the children of what they're learning. I think there's something quite fundamental about what happens in school. And I can see it happening. I see it happening to young children all around me all the time, where they go from seeing themselves as the active agent in their lives. I think that is how humans are born. Young children, they see themselves as people who can make a difference, often way above their abilities. And then they go into school, and at school they're told, this is more important. Doing this is more important than what you'd like to do. And it undermines their sense of who they are, actually. I think it undermines their sense of how they can choose what to do. So the advantage is we never take that away. And I think what that means is that as they get older, they choose challenging things for themselves without ever having learned the lessons of school, which are often things like, I should choose things that are easier for me because assessment is important. So I tell a story in my book where I had to choose my GCSEs, and I really would have liked to do art, but I wasn't very good at art. I was really good at music. I knew I'd get an A in music. I found the music teacher boring. I did not enjoy music, but I knew I'd get an A. I chose music. I got an A. And I've never really done art since. And I feel like one of the things the school system teaches kids is that learning is only worthwhile if you can get it, if you get assessed and validated and you can show you're good at it. And I think the massive advantage of self-directed education is that we can keep it open for a longer period for kids. So we can say, you can learn about art, you don't have to be good at it, because actually in life, being able to do things you enjoy is far more important than being really good at it. But we surround children with this environment where we say, you need to be good at things, you need to improve things, you need to show, if you're going to be serious about something, go do the GCSE. Why can't we just say, what are the things that you love to do? Let's do more of those. If you want to do it for a year, great. If you then want to stop, that's fine. We don't have to follow everything through in this way. But what I see is really valuable in the teenagers I see around me, the self-directed teenagers that I see around me, because my son's now a teenager and I know his peers, is that they have a real sense of themselves that I see lacking often from children who've gone through the school system, because they believe that what they choose to do is valid, and they know themselves, they know how they work, because they've never been kind of squashed and told you need to ignore your voice that says, for example, this is a waste of time, I don't want to do this, because you make those choices. And I just see amazing things from the teenagers where they choose to do things that I would never have imagined that self-directed teenagers would do. Like when I was starting out, for example, my son has a lot of trouble with handwriting. And I think this is quite typical for lots of self-directed kids because they don't do much writing. And he's got to the age of 13. He could write very little handwriting. He can type, but he can't handwrite. And we were talking about this the other day and saying if he wanted to do a GCSE, then he might need a scribe, or he might need to have special, to have a laptop so that he can type, because he won't be able to write. And he said, before we do that, I'm going to try and practice my handwriting. I want to see if I can improve my handwriting. And he's practicing his handwriting often. And I'm just amazed, because I'm not directing that. I'm not pushing him to do it at all. And just occasionally he brings down a thing and says, oh, look, I think I've got better at this. And I say, wow, you really have. And he really has. And I would just never have imagined, handwriting is one of those things that people say, oh, they're never going to want to practice handwriting. Well, I think if you want to do it, it's very different to somebody making you do it. And I remember handwriting being a bit of a bugbear for me as a child, because I'm left-handed. And we had to write with ink, and I would smudge all of my handwriting. So the whole thing. And I would remember the side of my hand being blue with blue ink, because we had to use these stupid ink pens. In retrospect, I have no idea why, because I never use an ink pen now. I just use a biro and there's no problem. So, yeah, I think, does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so. And I think the other thing is that, I'm sure that there must be some fear that comes along, because with self-directed, you're kind of having to let go a little bit. And, sometimes all of those having like a sort of school structure, having subjects and ticking off a box, it gives you some security. Yeah. That, I know my child covered this and this and this today, but with self-directed, you wouldn't.
No, it feels
that
terrifying.
You're taking some of that away. So yeah. Let's talk about the fears and the worries about it.
So, I think school provides us with a false sense of security, because with school, it feels like there's a progression that you're going through. And if you sort of start, you step on that ladder and off you go. But actually, we know that a third of children get to the end of school and don't get 5 GCSEs. They don't get the qualifications that it's all meant to be about. And a lot of children have very unhappy experiences at school. So I think the first step is to challenge our perception of school as this ultimate benign good place, which guarantees something, because I think for many, many people it doesn't. And there is a kind of dissonance, I think, between how school is kind of presented in the public eye and how it actually is for lots of children, including myself as a young person. And I think that's hard for people to manage, because it's kind of like, is there something wrong with me? Maybe there's something wrong with me. And I think part of what I was wanting to do with my book was say, there's lots of people who feel this way. As a psychologist, one of the enormous privileges I have is that I talk to lots of people about their experiences. So I have a kind of bird's eye perspective on things, which I think is harder for people to have as individuals. And so many people come with difficult experiences at school. And when you start to bring that all together, you think, well, how come we're not really hearing more about these stories? How come people don't know about them? How come people have this perception that it's all fine? And I think part of it is that people feel they're the only ones. They feel shamed. Parents often feel ashamed if their children don't do well at school, and they're often pressured by teachers who'll say, this is your fault, why can't you get that child into school? Or, the child hasn't got the message about how to behave, or not school ready, as if these are things that parents should be doing to their children. But I think also we don't really have a way of understanding how children grow and develop outside school. And I would say that was definitely the case for me. Even as a psychologist who's studied child development, I've studied cognitive development, there's never anything about what child development looks like outside school. There was an assumption of attending school. And I found it weird because, school is this massive intervention. If you think about it, it's 30 plus hours of time of children's lives every week. I mean, that is so much more time than, say, going to see a psychologist like me, which might be 1 hour a week. And yet we have to do research studies to show that 1 hour a week is worth it. And, to show that the approach we're using is actually going to help. But there's never been randomized control studies of actual school. We put children in this school for 30 hours a week. Is that better than doing something else with those hours, for example? So, and I think one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was to kind of show that children develop and children grow, whether they're in or outside the school system. And what I see, for example, with the teenagers is that we just don't know. Most people just don't have an image of what it looks like to be a teenager who hasn't been to school, or a teenager who doesn't go to school. And so we have this image of small children. So people will often say to me, oh, well, they're just doing things on a whim all the time. Are you still do they ever grow out of playing in the mud? Of course they do. They grow up, and they grow up in a different way. And I think it's scary because we just don't have that vision in our heads. Our heads are about what happens to children at school. And that's why my book's called Changing Our Minds, actually.
And I think there's a lot of trust involved, actually, because sometimes when you let go like that with your children and you kind of step back, they might seem to be doing nothing.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
What have you how have you kind of figured that out?
It's funny, isn't it? It's like there's a safety in making them do things, that we feel better about making our children do things than letting them choose to do things that we consider to be worthless. And I think one of the big mind shifts for me was realizing that control and that coercion is something that is damaging. So even if we may think they're doing nothing very much, and I think that's fine. There's a stage, particularly for children who come out of school, they often need quite an extended period where they don't do very much because they're just decompressing from the pressure. But also, I think what we as adults consider to be not very much is often a lot. It's just that we don't see it because we're used to seeing learning in one way. We're used to seeing it in a school way. And we're used to thinking, are they learning the curriculum? If I tested them, would they be able to do it? Are they reading? Are they writing? We don't see all the different things that they're learning. And I think a lot of that is a long-term thing, which is where the trust is hard, that on a day-to-day basis, it can be really hard to see what are they actually learning. And for me, certainly, it was like looking back when my children are 12 and 13, I think, wow, I can really see now where they've learned. So, for example, both of my children, I think, have really learned that if they want to learn something, they can do that, and that they are the person who can make that happen in different ways. So my son's really interested in geography at the moment. No idea where that's come from. But he's looking up all sorts of stuff about geography, and he keeps telling us all these facts about different countries and asking us things about which populations in different countries. And like last night, he said, do you know which countries are there that are not recognized by other members of the UN Security Council? I'm like, I don't know. And then we sort of get into Taiwan and all these things. And it's like, I just see this kind of explosion of interest and learning that's happening for him. And I find that so exciting. And I think it's something that I just love more people to know that this is what can happen when a child is allowed to learn on their own terms. Because so often what people say is, but will they ever choose anything difficult? Surely they're never going to choose anything challenging. And I find that a really interesting way of insight into how we perceive children, because adults choose challenging things all the time. Writing my book was one of the most challenging things I have done. It was not motivated by, no one paid me to do it. I had very little time to do it. I just really wanted to do it. It was extremely challenging, and I set it myself task and I did it. Why do we think that children wouldn't do that? Even young children who are definitely much more in the moment and are more play-based, they are amazingly committed to learning things when they want to learn. Just watch a baby learning to crawl, or a young child learning to walk. They will or a child learning to ride their bicycle. When my children learned how to ride their bicycle, they fell off and they fell off and they fell off and they fell off and they fell off until they stopped falling off. And I think this is a universal human capacity, which we squash by putting children into the school environment and saying, right, you've got to do this.
Well, they don't think they're learning hard stuff. That's the thing. For them, it's not, because their interest is there. And for people who don't know my story, I home educated 7 children. I'm in my 23rd or 24th year now, I can't remember. And my youngest is nearly 16. And I started off very structured with my children when I first started home educating, trying to do all the things and tick all the boxes. And over time, I realized that they didn't remember it any better than what they'd remembered in school. It was still the same thing, where somebody else is imposing learning on the child rather than them having the questions themselves. And in terms of talking about learning difficult things, my youngest son he wants to be an astrophysicist. I know nothing about physics. I'm not really any good on the sciences, but that's his thing. And so I've got tutors to support him because that's what he wants to pursue, and I want to give him his best chance. So, but that is totally from him, nothing to do with me whatsoever. And so you just, as a parent, you are making sure they have what they need to advance. Because, like, for instance, if they have to write an exam, I want to make sure they don't feel at a disadvantage. I want my child to feel confident. So whatever they're wanting to do, I'm wanting to give them the confidence and the courage to go ahead with whatever's is before them. But I like to use an analogy of a wardrobe. Now, a wardrobe, you can throw your clothes in and they'll all be there somewhere, but you might have some trouble finding what you're looking for. It needs a rail, it needs coat hangers, and then the clothes need to be hung on the coat hangers. And I feel like the rail kind of represents your child's like frame of reference, or the little thing that starts them off. And then they might have some knowledge and they need to know how to hook that knowledge like onto the rail and then attach everything else that goes with it. And then they can actually access that information because it makes sense in their own sort of neural pathways of how they got there. And so their own thinking is sorted in a way that they can access it when they need it and bring it back into play. So that kind of works for me. I don't know what you think of an analogy like that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what the analogy, the sort of analogy would then be with school, because school tries to give you that, doesn't it? It tries to give you the wardrobe, the full wardrobe with the things there already. Yeah. And I think it's so much more powerful when you're hooking the clothes hangers and putting the clothes up yourself, basically. And
sorting them in colours the way you like them. And
exactly.
So your own brain
and the way that makes sense to you, rather than this is what you should learn, this is how it is, this is how... This is, basically trying to kind of put it into you wholesale.
I think it would be, you don't have to put the wardrobe together. We put it together for you already. So you don't actually have to engage. It's all there already. And you're right. That's the difference.
Yes, there's no sorting. There's no sorting at all. It's all sorted. It's all here. You just need to learn it.
Just put it in your head.
Memorize it.
Put it in your head, spit it out at the exam, and you're done.
And that seems more efficient. And of course, in some ways it is. But it's a lot less interesting, and it's a lot less, it's not the same active process. And I think learning has to be an active process, and that can be, being taught by someone can be a very active process. It doesn't have to be, again, I'm saying self-directed education isn't about just leaving kids to get on with it. It's a very involved process, but it needs to be on their terms and led by their interest.
Yes, and I think that it's like, whether the child is actually actively engaged, whether they are actually taking that on and taking responsibility for their own learning, that makes a big difference in because mastery and excellence. And
it has meaning and purpose for them. And I think meaning and purpose is fundamental. And I think that's what we see, unfortunately, with young people coming out of the education system, that they've learned all this stuff, but it doesn't necessarily have meaning and purpose for them. And people often say to me, what happens to young people who are self-directed when they come out and they can't be self-directed anymore and they have to do what they're told? The strange thing is I think it's the opposite way round. We should be asking that question. We should be saying, what happens to young people who've never been allowed to make significant choices for themselves when they come out of the end of that and suddenly they have to make big decisions about their life and their child and everything about them? And we know what happens, most of us, because that's what happens at university a lot of the time. And a lot of what happens is people don't go to lectures, they don't engage with stuff, they don't really choose. I know I count myself as one of these people. They don't necessarily choose things that they're interested in learning because they haven't learned to choose what they're interested in. They've learned, like I chose to go to university and study medicine. The reason I chose that was partly because I could, and because there was very much a sort of focus on, if you can do these more challenging, like basically higher status university degrees, you should be doing them because not everybody can do physics and chemistry and maths, which is what I did at higher level, A-level. But I wasn't interested and I didn't really enjoy it. And I spent 2 years slogging away at this stuff thinking, gosh, and everybody said, you'll enjoy it when you get to clinical, you'll enjoy it then, it'll be okay. And I was like, gosh, this is really not me. And then I did a year of psychology, third year, because we could do an intercalated year in a different subject. And it was like the world opened up. It was like, oh my goodness, learning can be so much more interesting. And I was making connections everywhere in a way that I just wasn't with the medicine. It just, everything was kind of light. And I feel like I almost discovered at that point, wow, learning can be so much more interesting. And I feel so lucky to have been somewhere where I had that opportunity in my third year at university, because many other places, I would have gone straight on to medicine. I would have gone straight on to clinical medicine. And I would have probably been an unhappy doctor, because it wasn't something that, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with studying medicine, but for me, it wasn't the thing that really set me on fire, and psychology really was. And as you can see, I'm still talking about and learning about psychology all the time now.
Thanks, Naomi, just for sharing that. So we'll take questions in a minute, but I think one last thing I'd like to kind of cover is that self-directed education, what does it look like in practice? And is it always the same? Does it change? How do you adapt with your changing circumstances in your family?
So it's very different depending on your children and also their age. So when they're younger, it's usually about playing. It's about finding places for them to play, finding different kinds of play, finding children to play with. And I mean, again, I give the example of my two children who've both been self-directed learners, and they have chosen really, really different things to be engaged with. So my daughter is really into art, crafts, making things. That's kind of her main thing. My son is really into maths, physics, computers, and they have made those choices. I have provided options, and I think as the self-directed facilitator, your task is to provide options and to allow them to be refused. And I think that's the bit that parents find really hard. And I know I did when my children were young, the fact I would have these great ideas and I'd say them to my children and she'll be like, no. In fact, my son had this kind of line. I'd say, I've got this idea. And he'd say, Mummy, I have a better idea. And we wouldn't do my idea. So, and I suppose part of it was keeping on enriching their environment and providing things on the level that they liked and what interested them. So for him, when he was younger, the way that I tried to create an learning environment for him was I sought out good iPad apps that were quite similar to what he was already doing, but were just a bit different. And I would put them on his iPad, and then I wouldn't mention them, because I knew the moment I said to him, there's a new iPad app, he would be like, right, another boring idea from Mummy. So for my daughter, it was about providing lots of art supplies and helping her find other children who also liked art that we could do art together with. And it's really different. But I think one of the things that does change is that what I see with self-directed learners is that there's a long period of play-based to discovery-based learning, much longer than children are allowed to do at school. So my experience has been that if you allow children to continue with this stage, it goes on till they're 9 or 10 in lots of cases, where all they really want to do is play, and they're quite in the moment. They move from thing to thing. They're not very goal directed. You do something because you like doing it now. And this is when parents often panic, because they go, but they don't like doing it, and they just stop. How are they ever going to do a GCSE, or how are they ever going to do anything? Then they start to grow up and they go through puberty, and something happens at that point. And I think it's brain development where they become more able to set goals for themselves. And then I think the learning becomes more intentional and less in the moment. So, example, like my son with the handwriting, he doesn't do handwriting practice because he just really enjoys handwriting. He's doing it because he wants to be able to write better. And he has experienced that process many times because he's self-directed. He knows that if he wants to become better at something, he can practice it and he will get better at it. And I see that shift very much happening in a way that I probably would not have believed when my children were younger. I would not have believed that they would spend hours practicing something, not because they love doing that thing right now, but because they want to do it in the future. And I think that is a shift that's often difficult for parents to appreciate will happen, because school makes children do that. School says, right, you've got to learn to read. We're going to set that goal for you, and we are going to make you go through these steps so that you learn to read. which means that we take away from children the opportunity for them themselves to say, you know what, I'd like to learn to read. My daughter did this last summer. I'd like to learn to read. How can I learn to read? And I said to her, well, I could get these books if you want, and we could read them together, like reading scheme. And she said, no, I've got a better idea. I would like to read Toto and Silver, the Ninja Cats. Now, these are chapter books, okay? They're not beginner level reading books. And her reading was very basic at this stage. Really, she couldn't read. She said, I've listened to Toto and Silver lots of times on audiobook, and I think, therefore, they'll be good books to try to learn to read with. So I was like, okay, let's give that a go. And we did. And it was a real struggle for her at first. She found it really difficult, but she had listened to the audiobook lots of times, and that really helped her. And she went from struggling through a few lines to reading the whole of Toto and Silver, the Ninja Cat, the whole of the first book, and we're halfway through the second book. And now she could read a page fluently. So I see that as kind of an interactive process. And of course, I was there always listening to her, telling her what words meant if she wanted to. I pointed out things to her, like, the apostrophe means aisle or wheel, because she didn't know that. So I see that as a self-directed process of reading, which is part of how she's learned how she learns. And I think that will be really useful for her in the future.
I'm a huge believer in the role of play in the children's. Children should be allowed to play actually pretty much as long as they need to. There's a wonderful video, which I can go and have a look for the link and post in the chat, by a lady. I think she was the former CEO of the Lego Foundation. I don't know if you had a chance to watch that video yet, Naomi, but she talks about play and what happens when a child's brain, what happens to the brain when they're playing, and how the skills and things that are developed through play are better indicators of success than whether they can read or write at the age of 5. And so I found that like a really good video. So I'll try and share it in the chat. I'm going to take some questions now. We had one from Denise a little while ago, and Denise said, what have you found after children receive a self-directed education when they have to fit or adapt to a system that isn't self-directed? And I think it is, will they cope by moving into a different environment? And has any research been done on this?
So there's some research done by Peter Gray, and he looked at the self-directed schools in the US, Sudbury Valley School, and he's also looked at unschoolers and what happens to them. I mean, it depends what you mean by self-directed. You see, I think very few adults move into a situation where they have as little choice as children at school have. Even adults who go into jobs where you don't have much autonomy, you generally have a few choices, like the choice to go to the toilet if you need to go to the toilet and that kind of thing. But you also usually are taking a job for other reasons other than simply being there. Basically, you're paid for it. And so I think there's an element of autonomy in working that isn't there in school. Like, we take away every choice from children in school. And so I don't think it ever happens to adults that they have to go into that kind of environment, unless they go to prison or something, which is a whole different thing. So, so I would be less concerned about that, because I think what happens is we see self-directed young people growing up. When they go to university, for example, what they say, and what Peter Gray's research showed, was that they really don't quite understand the attitude of the other young people they're with at college, who are often there trying to get around the rules or trying to get their point, get their grades without putting in much work, because they're there because they want to do these things. They go to university or to college or to wherever because they want to do it. So that sort of self-direction carries on in their lives. And I think, as adults, a lot of us have to rediscover that in ourselves. I certainly think myself, I had to rediscover the kind of sense of what is it that I want to do here, and to choose to do difficult things for a higher goal is actually quite a difficult thing for adults to do, because they've been told they have to do things, and that kind of autonomy has been taken away from them. I know lots of adults will say, I can't learn something unless there's an exam at the end. I can't motivate myself unless I go and do a test. And I think that's really sad that we've done that to young people, so much so that they don't have that kind of drive to do these things for its own purpose. And there's a lot of research that shows that for work, for example, although we think that people are motivated by pay at work, Alfie Kern's work is a really good book, Punished by Rewards, that he wrote, which is showing that actually people at work, what predicts your best work is whether you feel you've got a sense of purpose in your work. And you can't actually impose that from the outside. Paying people more doesn't improve their performance at work, but them having purpose and autonomy in their work does. So I suppose I just don't think that's so much of a problem.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And I find that my children who've gone on to sort of colleges or universities have not really had any issues at all. Because in fact, they're more self-disciplined because they've already been managing their own learning. And
yes, because you have to be. At some point, you have to be.
They're pursuing some of the subjects because they want to. And so they are there because they want to be there. So it does make a big difference already.
Yeah.
But Peter Gray is worth going and looking at what he's written and videos he's done and so on.
And
I've got a question here, which I think you might be very well suited to answer from Molly. What advice would you give for parents of children who've experienced trauma in their background, as in adopted children? Home education has been wonderful for our birth kids, but it's very different with our adopted kids with trauma, sensory processing, and attachment issues. And Naomi does specialize in trauma. So I'm hoping that you bring some of that to this answer.
Yeah, I mean, everything is going to be very different with children who've had that kind of background. I do think that every child is different and every child is unique, and it is about working out the best way for each particular child. And it's possible that for some children, the right kind of school might help them, but mostly for children who've got trauma and sensory processing problems, school exacerbates those rather than making it better. So I think with those kind of issues, you basically have to take everything down a rung, and you have to think, okay, school tells us that learning and education is all about this content that children are going to learn, or these skills that they're going to learn. But actually, for lots of children, the basis is safety, feeling safe in your own body and just being able to ground yourself. And that's where it is. And that's where the parent needs to be working, so you're not necessarily thinking about how can they learn about maths or history. You're thinking, how can I help them learn to feel safe in their own body? And that is really difficult for parents because it can often feel like doing nothing, because what you need to be doing is soothing, connecting with them on however you can. Sensory stuff, you need to, when we used to have swings in our house, we used to have balls, we used to have bouncy things, we made our house basically quite a sensory environment when the children were younger, and that was what we did. And then I connected with them. So the other thing to do, I think, is join with them where they are, rather than trying to pull them to something else. If where they are is playing Minecraft, learn how to play Minecraft. Join with them. Get your own device. Download Minecraft. Watch some videos so they don't have to teach you. See if you can play that together. Try and join them wherever they are. The other thing that I do specifically with trauma is tell stories. So tell stories to children or make stories together about the things that have happened, because sometimes children can feel that, they have their own interpretations of why things have happened to them. And just keeping on talking about what did happen, why it happened, and every story that you tell needs to end with, and now you're safe. Now things are okay. Because often what happens with children who are traumatized is they're stuck in the trauma and the story isn't finished. And so some of the work I do therapeutically would be writing those stories with adults, and then we tell them to the children, and they always need to end with, and now the little girl is safe, and now she's living in a different place, and she's going to grow up, and she's going to be able to feel safe and comfortable in her home. And I think stories can be really powerful. And so that's one of the kind of deliberate, specific interventions that I would do. But other than that, it's just always about coming back into grounding, calming, soothing, not worrying about the other stuff, the maths and the English that will come in later, but you have to get the basis right first.
I think that makes me think a little bit of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yes.
Which I know is not everyone, as with any theory, there's some people, people don't all agree with it. But basically, certain needs need to be met for you to feel safe, to branch out sort of and try something new, to feel brave. Yeah. And, so your very basic needs, your physical needs, but then you've got the fear and anxiety or that fight or flight response that some children have in certain environments. So you've kind of got to really work on that first, on those foundational things,
and empathize with that, I think. Getting alongside them and empathizing with how hard that is. Yeah. Because it's so easy to feel frustrated.
Yeah.
And to feel they should be able to be different to how they are.
Yeah. Yeah. You've got some deep-seated things to address. And I'm sure, Molly, that Naomi would be happy to engage with you privately if necessary, if you needed any further support on that. One last question, because our hour is almost up. Mm-hmm. We've got some people in the chat or in the group today that are involved in the education system in some way and trying to change the way things are done. Do you think the education system can change? Do you think that we'll ever get to a time where the government will actually listen to all the researchers and the wisdom and the experience that people are talking about and trying to, we're all trying to get the government to listen and change things,
I'd like to believe it could, but at the moment it feels very much like it's happening outside the mainstream education system. But I think there is a swell of grassroots support outside it, because I think there's a growing recognition of how many children are not having their needs met through the education system. There are people trying to do things differently. I can see Derry's here. His book is a great book to read if you're interested. Can't remember what it's called. What's it called, Derry? There is another way, I think, being a democratic, it's about how he brought in a democratic learning community in a state secondary modern school, year 7s and 8s. Really worth a look at.
Feel free to share that in the chat, Derry.
What's that, Derry?
It's called Another Way is Possible.
Another Way is Possible. Yeah.
Do you want to share that information in the chat?
There's another book which I'd recommend is by someone called Geraldine Rowe, which is called It's Our School, It's Our Time. And that's about collaborative decision making in schools. So that's about ways that some teachers have been trying to bring in some aspects of collaboration and autonomy in schools with their classes. So there is some stuff happening, but a lot of it at the moment is happening in alternative provision.
Yes, we've seen some very successful programs in different. Summerhill is a very good example, but I know they've tried things all over the world. And it works, but we don't see government sort of saying, "Great, this looks wonderful. We're going to do this." So I think that is a big frustration. And somebody else mentioned that it's very important for us to take part in every single consultation, to make sure we are informed about political stuff going on so that we can have a say, because, parents, I believe parents should have the freedom to choose how their children are educated. Unless there's some severe reason why they shouldn't be, but their parents should have that choice, because we are the ones that ultimately carry the consequences of whatever happens to your child in their learning years. As a family, you're the one who's going to have to deal with any fallout. So I think we are going to finish. We've got some things coming up in the chat there. So I want to give people just a chance to take things down. So I want to just come back to talking a little bit about our Streams website. If you go to streams.education, you can sign up as a member to qualify for our giveaway today. And we would love to see you on there. We'd love to hear your stories and have you share, just personal stories that can encourage other home educators. We also have a Facebook page and an Instagram, and eventually we will have a whole library of these webinars, because we will be doing more of these. Every month we will have a webinar on a resource, and we will have a webinar like this with Naomi, where we chat with an expert and somebody that's got some wisdom to share with us. So please, go and like our Facebook page, go and find us, and then you will be kept updated. And you can also sign up for our newsletter. So it's all sorts of ways you can stay informed And we'd love to have your contributions on the website. So thank you for attending today. And a big thank you to Naomi for her time. It's been very informative. We could probably do this again and carry on the conversation. I mean, I could do one just on play, literally just talking about playing. So I think we will probably see you again, Naomi, I hope.
Thank you, Juliet.
Yeah.
It's been really nice to be here.